Hello, today we'll be going over nested for loops and class constants in Java. So first we'll review normal for loops from last time, and then we'll go over learning nested for loops and then learn class constants. So normal for loops, as you may remember from last time, they have three parts: the initialization, the test, and the increment. You can review more on these from last video. Okay, so it's much easier to learn things when we use an example because it's much better to visualize things. So we'll be using this example. We'll print out this triangle to the console. So first, let's look at the problem. Each row in the triangle, there are four rows in the triangle, and each row also has two parts, which is the number of spaces, which might also be 0, and then the number of dots inside the triangle. So let's start with creating the outer for loop. The outer for loop will represent the number of rows in the triangle, which in this case is 4 rows. So we'll need to run this outer for loop 4 times, and that's one time for each row. And that's why when we start at I equals 1, it'll be till I is less than or equal to 4 for 4 rows in total. And another way we can do this is by starting out I at 0 and then going till I is less than 4 instead of less than or equal to 4. But I'm going to be sticking with this because it will be much easier to do some calculations that we'll do later on. So let's look at inner for loops. And inner for loop, any amount of inner for loops that we have, they will correspond to whatever we'll do in one row. So since we have two things going on in one row, which is the number of spaces in front and then the number of dots, we will likely have two inner for loops. So let's look at the first inner for loop. The first one will represent the number of spaces in each row. So let's create a table to better visualize things. For the first row, we can see that there are 3 spaces, and the second row we can see there are 2 spaces, and in the third row there is 1 space, and in the fourth row there are 0 spaces. So the number of spaces are decreasing as we increase the number of rows. So a way we can write this in an equation is the number of spaces is equal to 4 minus I, where I is the row number. And we can test this out as well. 4 minus 1 will be 3. 4 minus 2 is 2. 4 minus 3 is 1. 4 minus 4 is 0. And so this we can use to in our for loop test to check how many times we'll print out a space. And this way we can relate our row number with the number of spaces, which is how we can create this pattern of decreasing spaces. And so we can see over here in our first inner for loop, we have j is going to less than 4 minus I. So it's going to print out 4 minus I times a space, 4 minus I times. So for example, if we are in the first row, which would mean I is 1, we should have j going to less than 4 minus 1, which is 3, which would print out 3 spaces. And we can see that's correct based on our chart here. And we can test this out for different values of I as well. And also notice that we use j in our inner for loop. It's just a common convention to use the outer for loop is j, the inner for loop is I, and if we have another for loop inside this for loop, it'll be k. It's just an ijk pattern, and it's common convention. And then for our second for loop, which will be for the number of periods, we can create another chart. So for the row number 1, we have 1 dot. And then for row number 2, there are 3 dots. Row number 3, there are 5 dots. Row number 4, there are 7 dots. So we can create an equation that relates the row number with the number of dots. And that equation is 2 times I minus 1. And we can see this is correct by plugging in different values for the row number, such as 2 times 1, which is 2, minus 1 should be 1, which is correct. And 2 times 2 is 4, minus 1 is 3, 2 times 3 is 6, minus 1 is 5, and so on. And this expression we can use in our inner for loop for the number of periods, and that will tell the program how many times to run that for loop. So As we can see, we have added a new for loop inside this other for loop to check the number of times this period will be printed. So it goes to j is less than 2 times I minus 1, which is the expression we found here. And we can test this out as well. So for example, for I equals 1, which would be for the first row, this would go to j is less than 2 times 1 minus 1, which is 1. And that makes sense because we should only have one period in our first row, as you can see here. And then we have created our program. Let's run this to see what happens. Oh no, we have this entire program printing out on one line. So to fix this, we need to realize that our outer for loop represents the number of rows over here. So we need to go to the next line after we're finished with printing out one row, which is what these for loops do. So to fix this, we can just add this empty println to just go to the next line after one row is finished. And that will work. And we're done with nested for loops. Let's go on to class constants now. To create a class constant, we just use these keywords: public, static, final, then the type, then the name, and then its value. So you can ignore what public, static, final mean for now. They aren't important to learn what they are now. But an int is just its value for now. Our size is just a number, and 4, we can set this value to anything. For now, we'll just set it to 4 because this is what we have for our triangle at first. It's of size 4, which is 4 rows. This represents the number of rows. Also, one thing to keep in mind, usually class constants are fully capitalized with an underscore that replaces any spaces that may occur. Let's look at what this will be working towards. So a size 4 triangle will just print out this triangle over here. Size 10 triangle would be a bit bigger with 10 rows. Size 30 would be really big with 30 rows. So what do we need to change in our program? So first we need to add this line of code before our main function in our program, and that'll create a constant that we can use anywhere in our program. And next we should think about what size, which is our constant, actually means. In our case, it means the number of rows that our triangle will have. Let's get into changes we need to make. So first, the number of rows that we had before was represented by the test for our for loop, our outer for loop. So we can change this I is less than or equal to 4 by I is less than or equal to size, which is our constant. So it'll run this outer for loop for the number of rows that we have, which is equal to size. And for this inner for loop that deals with the number of spaces, we have our previous expression that we had over here, but we need to somehow change this to deal with any number of any size, not just 4. So we can use our table that we had from a few slides before, where we found this expression, and we can realize that if we do j is less than size minus I, this will determine the number of spaces I will have based on any size. So for example, if size is 10, this would be 10 minus I. If size is 11, it'd be 11 minus I, and so on. And then for this for loop over here, which deals with the number of periods, we actually do not need to change anything, because then this this I value will just keep increasing no matter what, and that will print out the number of spaces that keep increasing. So if we go to our triangle over here, the number of spaces, or the number of dots, keeps increasing based on the size, while our spaces, they kept decreasing. So we actually had to factor in the size. We don't really need to factor in the size because this keeps increasing no matter what size. So we don't need to change anything for this for loop over here. And then the rest of the code will just be the same. And this will be the final code where we change the outer for loop condition to size and this inner for loop condition to size. And this doesn't need to change. And you can change the size value to whatever you want. And you did it. This is really hard. These things are really hard to learn. Nested for loops and class constants and putting them together. So I encourage you to experiment and try things out, and it'll make your learning much easier and much better.